Story number 1. The Smiling Man. When I was around 10 years old, I walked to the store around the corner from my house all by myself. I usually wasn't allowed to walk alone. My mom was busy and my dad wasn't home, so my mom gave me money and told me to go get a few things. This was a big deal. I was only 10, but my mom trusted me enough to go to the store on my own. I felt so free. So independent. I loved it. However, that day was just the beginning of what would be a horrible year for me and my family. I walked to the store. I kept the money hidden and I didn't stop or talk to anyone on the way there. My mom told me to walk straight back, so I did. It was a hot day. If you know anything about California, you'll know that in the summer it gets really hot. I decided to take a shortcut through the park. It would take me straight to my house, and then I could use the trees for shade. It wasn't a good idea to leave the open street, but I didn't think of it back then. I was about halfway through the park when I saw a man. He was wearing a hoodie, which I thought was a little weird given how hot it was. He was peeking out from behind a tree near the path. I slowed down a little when I realized that he was peeking out at me. I thought about turning back and heading towards the street, but I was already halfway to my house, and the idea of turning my back on the man scared me. I decided to push forward. I neared the tree he was peeking behind. I figured he didn't know that I had spotted him, since he darted back behind the tree as I got closer. I was worried that he would jump out at me when I walked past, so I took off running. I ran all the way home, never looking back to see if he was chasing me. When I got home, I looked out the window. No one was there. I decided that I had overreacted, so I didn't tell my mom about it. The next day, me and my siblings were playing in the street in front of our house. I had a younger sister and 2 older brothers. We all got along well and often played outside together. My brothers went inside to get us all drinks. My sister and I stayed on the front porch. That was when a man approached us. He was very tall and very thin. I remember his smile more than anything else. He had a huge smile, and it always seemed to stay plastered on his face, no matter what. He walked right up to the front porch with his hands in his pockets. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I remember that he knew our names. That's why we didn't run inside or try to call someone. He knew us. We thought he was a friend of our parents. Suddenly, I heard my brother shout from the doorway behind us. The man looked up, saw my brother, and ran. My brother dropped the drinks he had in his hand, shattering the glass all over the floor, and he ran after the guy. My older brother told us to get inside quick, and we called our parents. After that, things got a lot worse. The man would keep coming back to the house. He'd drive by in a blue car and lean out the window, waving at me and my sister. He'd always seem to show up whenever we went outside. My parents or my older brothers would always run out and chase him away when he did. Eventually, they stopped letting us go outside alone. He started calling the house every day. Sometimes he'd call twice a day, always late at night, and he'd always ask to talk to me or my little sister. I decided to tell my dad about the time I saw a man watching me when I walked through the park. He questioned me about it. He kept asking if I talked to the man at all. I told him that I didn't. I ran home without saying anything. That got my dad wondering how he knew our names. We got the police involved, but they couldn't do anything. My older brothers started to walk my sister and me to school and home when my parents couldn't drive us. We became so scared that he would show up at any second. It was like we weren't living our lives anymore. It was months down the line now, and we hadn't seen or heard from the smiling man in a while. I was with my sister in the playground after school, waiting for our mom to pick us up. Most of the children were gone already, and it was just us and the one teacher. She came out to tell us that our dad had just arrived to fetch us. We both thought that was odd, since it was supposed to be our mom. We didn't question it at first. We were young and we trusted our teacher. We ran outside, giggling and just being kids. That was when I saw the blue car. The smiling man was standing by the open door with his hands in his pockets. He looked at us and told us to get in. I stepped back, grabbing my sister's shoulders and pulling her with me. The man leaped forward, trying to snatch my sister's arm. I let out the loudest scream as I ran back towards the school. I held on to my sister's hand tightly, dragging her behind me. I kept screaming for the teacher, and she ran out to meet us. We reached her, and I turned around just in time to see the blue car drive away. The teacher called the police, and we waited inside until my mom finally came to pick us up. She was running late, and she had called the school to let them know that. The school said they received another call saying that our dad was going to pick us up instead. My dad denied that he ever made that call. We kept seeing that same car throughout the rest of the year. We'd see it drive by the school while we were on the playground, or we'd spot it parked a few streets down from our house. After what happened at school, he never got closer, and he never tried anything again. After a while, I stopped seeing the blue car. I don't know if he got bored and decided to stop stalking us, or if he just got better at hiding from us. Story number 2. Want some candy? When I was around 17 years old, my parents took us all to the circus. I wasn't interested at the time, but both my younger sister and brother were only 7 and 12, so the trip was mostly for them. I enjoyed it as best I could. I got to go on some of the bigger rides, but eventually my sister got upset that I was going on rides without her. I spent the rest of the day going with her on the smaller, less fun rides. My brother, who was 12 and convinced that he was the man of the house when my father wasn't around, usually ran off on his own. He disappeared, and when I got off one of the rides with my little sister, I found my parents in hysterics. I calmed them down, and we split up to look for them. My father got into his car and drove around the parking lot. My mother went to go find some security guards. I took my little sister and began searching the different rides and attractions. I knew my brother loves clowns, even though my mother had a huge fear of them, so that was the first place I looked. There was a large tent set up right in the center of the circus. We'd strategically avoided it, but I knew my brother wanted to go since we arrived. I was about to go inside when I spotted my brother. He was around the back of the tent, and it looked like he was talking to someone. I put my sister down and walked slowly towards him. As I got around the tent, I saw one of the clowns hunched over and talking with my brother. I didn't think anything of it, so I announced myself and called out to my brother. The clown straightened up instantly. He glared at me and walked away. I thought it was odd. I asked my brother what he wanted. He said that the clown asked him if he wanted candy, but that he didn't take any. My parents were spooked, even though I found my brother, so we went home after that. I decided not to tell my parents about the encounter, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way that clown glared at me and walked away gave me the creeps. My parents let my siblings stay up late that night to make up for leaving the circus early. They were exhausted, though. I agreed to watch my brother and sister while they got an early night. We watched a movie and had a few snacks. I was ready to go to bed myself, but I promised them we could watch one more movie. My brother jumped up and rushed to the kitchen to get more snacks. There was a glass sliding door you had to walk past on the way to the kitchen. I watched out of the corner of my eye as my brother stopped, turned to look out the sliding door, and wave at someone. My heart sank in my chest, and a lump formed in my throat. I shot to my feet and rushed over to him. I peered out through the door, my breath steaming up the glass. The garden was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything. I asked him who he was waving to, and he told me it was the clown. I grabbed his hand and made him sit on the couch next to my sister. I pulled the curtain closed over the sliding door and then ran through the rest of the house, making sure all the windows and doors were locked. I thought about going upstairs to wake up my parents. That was when I heard a knock at the front door. Our front door had one of those old-fashioned letter slots. I stared at the door in horror as the slot opened up and a red, gloved hand squeezed through. The hand opened up and candy dropped to the floor. The sound it made as it hit the wooden floorboards and bounced still haunts me to this day. I grabbed my siblings and took them up the stairs. I woke my parents up and told them what was happening. We called the police, but by the time they got there, the clown was gone. They agreed to patrol the area for the rest of the night in case he came back. The fact that he was able to follow us all the way home is what scared me the most. Now, just like my mother, I have an extreme fear of clowns. Story number 3. Always Mine. When I was in high school, I had a stalker. There was this girl, her name was Cindy, and she used to sit on the bus right behind me and stare at me the whole ride. She'd follow me in the hallways, and she even joined a few of my classes in order to stay close to me. I ignored her at first, but things got really creepy really fast. She would show up at my house and tell my parents I invited her over. She once climbed up to my bedroom window on the second floor and tapped on it in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. I'll never forget that creepy smile she gave me when I pulled the curtains back. She'd leave me gifts in my locker at school, things like poems, pictures of her, and notes. All the notes would always say the same thing: "You'll always be mine." At some point, I decided to get the school's counselor involved. Both he and the principal sat down with Cindy and her parents. They moved out of town, and Cindy was enrolled in a different school. I never saw her again. A few years later, I graduated and moved into the dorms at my college. I had managed to get the same room as my best friend. We were so ready to start our lives. Not too long after I started my classes, I met Ella. She was amazing. She was smart, funny, beautiful, and she liked me. We hung out so much that my friend actually got a bit jealous of her. He started to tell me how creepy she was and that I needed to dump her. I brushed off his comments. She wasn't that creepy. She did want to spend a lot of time with me, but I liked her so much that I didn't mind. Not too long after that, I got back to my dorm after my last class of the day to find Ella sitting on my bed. She was waiting for me. When I asked her how she got in, she told me that the door wasn't locked, so she let herself in and decided to wait for me. It was a little weird, especially since I knew I had locked the door, but I still thought that she was sweet enough to wait for me. It got a little weirder after that. She started sending me gifts, and I mean a lot of gifts. Sometimes she would send me like 5 a day. The gifts were always things that I loved. Now, that might seem okay, but these were things I didn't tell her that I liked. Once I found a pack of Oreos sitting inside my car on the passenger seat with a note from her. Oreos were my favorite, but I never told her that. Also, my car was locked and I had no idea how she got the gift inside. I decided to distance myself from her, but that only made it worse. She stalked me around campus and jumped out at me from behind walls and benches. She said she was being playful. While all this was happening, my roommate decided to do some digging on her. He found out that she wasn't even a student at the college. She was on campus all day, but she didn't go there. I broke up with her. It was just too weird after that point. Later on, me and my roommate got back to the dorm after a night out drinking to find another gift from her. This time, it was inside the dorm. We had locked the door, and only we had a key each. The gift was a bouquet of flowers and a note that said, "You'll always be mine." My heart sunk to the floor, and the blood in my veins turned cold. It was the same handwriting and the same words. I dropped the note and called the police. My friend was confused, but I explained later. The police got involved, and there was a whole investigation. They found out that Ella was really Cindy from my high school. Her full name was Cinderella, and both names were just shortened versions. She had stolen my key for both my car and room at one point and cut copies for herself. I couldn't stay after that. I transferred colleges, and the police kept looking for her. They never found her, and I have spent my whole life looking over my shoulder, expecting to see her right behind me. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button and subscribe right away. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications of more terrifying videos. Story number 1. Home Sweet Home. When I was around 8 years old, my family and I were forced out of my childhood home. We didn't want to leave, but we didn't have much of a choice. Something horrible happened to my mother. I won't go into detail, but I'll try to explain. One night, a man broke into our house. My brother was sick, and I had gone with him and my father to the hospital. My mom was home alone. When we got home, we found her murdered. You can imagine how it would be hard for us to stay in that house. My father still owns the house, but we ended up moving into an apartment in another country. I didn't think much of the house while I was growing up. My father died a few years ago. It was natural and he went peacefully. He had left the house to me and my brother. My brother didn't want anything to do with it, so it was basically mine. I remember the day I drove down to the house. I hadn't seen it in years, and my curiosity got the better of me. It's strange how much a house can change after being left empty for so long. The wooden floors creaked differently, and the hinges on the doors squeaked loudly. I walked through the house, just looking around. It smelt of dust and urine. I spotted a few rats scurrying away, and the thought of breathing in rat urine made me sick, so I decided to open up a few windows. I got to the kitchen window that led to the back of the house. There was a small backyard. It had one tree growing near the back corner, leaning up against the tall fence. I almost laughed when I saw the small treehouse my father had built for us. The tree also had an old wooden swing hanging from one of the branches. As I opened up the kitchen window, I noticed that the swing was swaying slightly. It moaned ever so slightly as it swung back and forth. I thought it was odd, since there wasn't really a breeze that day, but I didn't spend too much time thinking about it. I got to the attic. It was a large room, and when I was a kid, it was our play area. We kept all our toys up there. There was a small, circular window right at the end of the room that looked down on the backyard. I walked through the attic slowly. I had so many good memories of being up there with my brother. I got to the other end and peered out the small window. Looking down at the small garden below, all those memories came flooding back. I stood there for a while. I was about to turn away from the window. That was when I saw it. There was a face. It was small and pitch black. You wouldn't have known it was a face if it weren't for the two small eyes. Those eyes stared directly at me from the treehouse. I froze. I didn't look at the face directly. Instead, I peered at it from the corner of my eye. The face didn't move. It stared at me from the holes in the treehouse walls. It was unnaturally still, and the eyes were unblinking. I thought it was something painted onto the wall at first, and that's why I decided to look up at it. My eyes finally met its eyes, and the face instantly vanished into the darkness at the back of the treehouse. The blood in my veins turned to ice. My heart was pounding in my chest. My feet took off before my brain had caught up. I raced down the stairs and made my way out the house. I didn't stop to breathe until I was safely in my car and the doors were locked. I sat there for a while. I wondered why I had freaked out so much. I thought about going back into the house since I left without closing any of the windows or even locking the front door. As I reached for my door, I looked up at the house and I saw the face again. I had left the front door ajar when I ran out and the face peered at me from behind it. I turned the keys in the ignition and drove away. I sent the police there the next day and they cleared the place out. They didn't find anybody, but there was evidence that somebody had been living inside the treehouse, and that was about it. I haven't been back to the house, and I still try to convince myself that what I saw was probably some crazy homeless person with black paint all over their face. The truth is, I have no idea what I saw that day. I have even less of an idea what they would have done to me if I hadn't have noticed them in time and gotten out of there. Story number 2, To the Extreme. When I first heard about extreme tourism, I was all for it. It was dangerous, risky, and a total adrenaline rush. I was in university at the time and life was pretty mundane. Anyway, I decided to give it a try around summer break. I didn't go alone. I mainly had one friend in university, and that was Travis. I mentioned a trip for summer break, and he was on board. I decided to keep the part about extreme tourism to myself until we got there. Now, I should probably explain what extreme tourism is. Tourism usually involves visitors in a foreign country being led around by an experienced local. They get shown the sights, take a few pictures, and then go back to their hotel rooms. The extreme version of that is similar, but the sights we get shown are a lot more dangerous. I went for a package that would take us on a guided tour through Pripyat, the abandoned town just outside of Chernobyl. Keep in mind, I took this trip back in the early 2000s, and not many people were willing to go that close to Chernobyl back then. It might be a popular tourist site these days, but back then it was extreme. We spent a few days in Moscow first, and we really enjoyed ourselves. The day of the tour came, and the tour guide picked us up in his Jeep. It was rusty, and the gears grinded, but it was all part of the experience. I had my phone out, filming and taking pictures the whole time. A few hours went by, and we reached the town. We just drove down the road at first. It was a ghost town. Not a single living soul was there. I heard howls in the distance and birds chirping in the trees, but there was nothing inside the town itself. The buildings were crumbling, but still stood tall. Vines grew up their sides and roots found a way to break through the road. It was amazing. We stayed there for a couple of hours. After our first drive-through, the tour guide took us back to one of the apartment buildings. He parked and we climbed out, but Travis refused. He stayed in the car and I went with the tour guide into one of the abandoned buildings. It was eerie, seeing the stairwells and hallways empty. It was silent. The only sound I could hear were my footsteps crunching on the dry leaves and broken tiles. I took photos of everything. It was left as it was on the day of the evacuation. Nothing had been touched and nothing had been taken. About halfway through the building, the tour guide went back outside to check on Travis. I stayed behind. I wanted a few more pictures and to get a video of myself walking through one of the apartments. I was setting up for the video when I heard the crunching of footsteps in the hallway just outside. I paused. I thought that I was alone. I called out, expecting it to be the tour guide either returning with Travis or coming to take me back down to the car, but I didn't receive a reply. I was standing in the middle of the living room of one of the apartments. The door behind me was slightly ajar, leading into the hallway. The footsteps I heard sounded like they were coming from the stairwell and making their way towards me. When I had called out, they stopped. I went silent for a while. I expected to hear the footsteps again, but the only thing I heard was my own heartbeat. I decided to call out again. This time I didn't call out to anyone. I just said hello. I received no response, but the sound of footsteps returned. This time they were running straight towards me. I rushed towards the door. I slammed it shut just as the footsteps reached me. Something slammed against the door, almost knocking me away and throwing it open. I pressed my body against the door. I didn't know what was happening. The place was meant to be abandoned. The whole town was empty. My first thought was that it was some kind of animal that had turned the building into its home. That thought flew out the window when I looked down and watched the doorknob slowly turning. I shot my hand down and wrapped my fingers around the doorknob. Something was trying to turn it, but I held it in place. They began banging on the door. They couldn't be an animal, but they were banging on the door so hard that it shook and shuddered. I thought it might fly off the hinges. I don't know how long I stood there with my body pressed against the door, holding the doorknob in place. Eventually, the banging stopped. I didn't feel a pull on the doorknob anymore, but I was too afraid to let go. I stayed there. There was no sound, and I thought that I was alone again. Suddenly, I heard footsteps out of the silence again, but this time, I also heard Travis's voice calling for me. I flung the door open and rushed towards his voice. He was coming up the stairwell, and I practically ran into him. I grabbed his hand and pulled him back down the stairs. I didn't explain what was happening until I got both him and the tour guide back into the Jeep. I told them what happened to me and why I didn't come back out. The tour guide got us out of there. From that point on, I kept my adventures a little less extreme, and I stayed far away from anything that seemed abandoned. Story number 3, Ghost Town. I live in a small town. It's one of those towns where everyone knows everyone, and the population never goes higher than 3 digits. I like the smallness of it. I know some might not. The weird thing about my town is that we have a neighboring ghost town. It's kind of like an urban legend for us. The town just a few miles down the road from us was abandoned in the dead of night. No one knows why or where everyone went. They just vanished. It's such a big thing in my town that the youth have turned it into a game. Staying the night in one of the abandoned houses has become a coming-of-age thing. When I turned 16, it became my turn to spend the night in the ghost town. I wasn't scared. I heard all the stories, but no one really knew what happened to the town. It happened decades ago, before my parents were even born. It was unlikely anything supernatural. The night came and I packed a sleeping bag, some snacks, a power bank for my phone, and some headphones. I threw the bag out of my bedroom window. My friends were waiting in my backyard to catch it and take it to the car. I told my parents I was just going to a sleepover, and I left. My friends drove me to the edge of the ghost town and dropped me off. They wouldn't go further. They had to drop me off and pick me up. That way they can be sure that I actually stayed there the night. I walked into the town, and the term ghost was an accurate one. It was dead silent. A thick fog seemed to hang in the air, but only inside the town. The road was old cobblestone, and the houses were more like shacks I'd seen in movies with medieval villages. I wasn't scared going into the town, but as I walked around, something unnerved me. I had the feeling I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder to check if I was being followed. My footsteps seemed to echo, making me feel like they weren't only mine. The town was supposed to be completely empty, but I didn't feel alone. Still, I carried on. I wasn't about to chicken out and run the 2 miles back into my own town. I picked the first house that didn't look like it was falling apart, and I rushed in. I set up my sleeping bag and wrapped myself up. I ate a few snacks and listened to some music to calm myself down. I didn't think I was going to get any sleep at all. The wind blew hard outside. The house seemed to move and bend with the wind. It moaned and groaned. Aside from the cold white light coming from my phone screen, it was completely dark. I couldn't see a thing. Something funny happens when you stare into the darkness for long enough. You start to see shapes forming and moving. Your mind plays tricks with you. The darkness moves in on you, and sinister creatures appear to live in it. I know that all these things can happen when you're sitting alone in darkness. However, that's not what happened to me. As I sat there, surrounded by the pitch black, things did appear. I saw eyes, red, glowing eyes, peering at me from the dark. It looked like there were thousands of them. They seemed to blink and move as one, as if they all belonged to the same monstrous creature. I didn't know what to do. Would you have known what to do? I was basically stuck there. I didn't just feel like I was being watched. Now, I had 1,000 eyes staring at me. My first thought was that they were rats or some other pests that had turned the abandoned building into their nest. My second thought was a lot more sinister and otherworldly. I slowly sunk into my sleeping bag. They followed every move I made and even seemed to move with me. I didn't want to turn my phone's light off. The thought of being plunged into complete darkness scared me. At the same time, I wondered if the light was the only reason the eyes could keep track of me. I decided to zip the sleeping bag closed all the way. I tucked my head into it and pulled it shut, keeping my phone light with me. My body wouldn't stop shaking even though I was sweating from the heat. It got worse after I zipped up the bag. The eerie silence was replaced by a soft chorus of squeaks. I didn't know what kind of sound it was. I'd never heard it before. My mind decided that it was ghostly whispers. The night lasted an eternity. Those whispers were in my ear the whole time, and all I could think of were those red eyes watching me. I imagined they were moving closer and closer until they were right on top of me. Before I even knew it was sunrise, the alarm on my phone went off. I jumped out of my sleeping bag, not caring about the red eyes or what they belonged to. I rushed out of the house, leaving the sleeping bag and most of my stuff behind. My friends would be waiting by the road to pick me up. I didn't look back as I ran. I didn't tell my friends what happened. It was only after I left the town that I began to rationalize what I saw. It could have been bats or even raccoons that were staring at me that night. Still, in the moment, I wondered if they were the ghosts of the town's old occupants, ready to punish me for trespassing. Story number 1. Empty Eyes. I've been interested in cosplaying for as long as I can remember. I'm interested in a lot of things, so being into dressing up as my favorite characters from movies, shows, animes, and games isn't that odd. I'm mostly into horror. Movies like The Conjuring and games like Resident Evil were my favorite. People usually thought it was odd for a girl to be interested in cosplaying as horror characters. Most girls liked dressing up as sexy anime characters. I was never really into that sort of thing. I grew up with 5 older brothers, so you can see why my tastes are so different from other girls. They liked playing gruesome video games and watching gory movies. I was never that into gore, but the horror aspect did intrigue me. It wasn't long until my brothers and I decided to take our cosplaying interests to Comic-Con. At Comic-Con, there was literally something for everyone. There were people dressed as anime characters, superheroes, video game characters, and more. You won't be surprised if I told you that for every section there was a gory version of that section. My brothers were into that gory stuff, so we always hung around those sections. The one year, I decided to dress for the part. Usually, I would simply dress up as one of my favorite characters. However, since we were going to be hanging around all the bloody and gory versions of characters, I decided to really play the part. I was a bit short on cash that year, so I decided to do something simple. I just dressed up as Ashley Graham from Resident Evil 4, and then I covered myself in fake blood. I even took it a step further and made it look like my throat was slit and blood was coming out of it. I was proud of the results, and my brothers seemed impressed too. Anyway, the day was going well, and I hadn't seen any outfits that made me sick yet. There was a lot of blood, but you could tell that it was fake, and everyone smelt like cherries. It seemed like I was the only girl there at the time, so I got a lot of attention. Things were going great until I noticed the man dressed as Winnie the Pooh. Remember, we're in the gory section, so this wasn't just any Winnie the Pooh outfit. His fur was muddy, his eyes were gorged out, and only black holes remained. His mouth hung open loosely, revealing long rows of sharp, pointed teeth. I only noticed as we got closer, but there was also blood dripping from the corners of his mouth and the long claws on his hands. There was something unnerving about him. Maybe it was the unnatural way he moved, or maybe it was because the blood on his outfit looked a little too real. I tried to stay clear of him, but he seemed to be following me. I noticed that wherever I went, he followed. Whenever I looked over at him, he was staring directly at me with those empty, black eyes. The guy was creepy, but he hadn't actually done anything. I decided to forget about him and enjoy my day. That was a mistake. I wasn't watching him anymore, so when I looked again to see where he was gone. I figured he'd finally left, but that's not what happened. I moved away from my brothers to go to the bathroom. There were a lot of bathrooms to choose from, and I just happened to choose one that was in a quieter, more secluded part of the convention. I walked through the door to the ladies' bathroom, and I came face to face with Winnie the Pooh. It was the ladies' bathroom, but at the time I convinced myself that it could be a girl inside that outfit. I went into one of the stalls and locked the door behind me. I was as quiet as a mouse. I didn't actually do anything while I was there. I think I was too scared to put myself in that vulnerable position, so I just sat down and waited. I heard footsteps, muffled and distant. I heard a door lock. I thought it might have been the stall next to me, but the locking sound was more distinct. It was the main door to the bathroom. I gulped hard. The lump forming in my throat made it hard to breathe. The footsteps stopped, and I saw a shadow appear in the gap underneath the door. I stared at the gap. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I placed my hand over my mouth to silence the scream forcing its way out. I had been too focused on the gap beneath the door. I could see the shadow, and I could hear his breathing, but I couldn't see him. He must have been standing away from the door, because I couldn't see his feet. That was when it dawned on me. The heavy breathing I could hear wasn't coming from in front of me. It was coming from above me. My head shot up, and I saw those black eyes staring at me from above the stall door. His mouth was wide open, and for a moment he looked at me as if I was some kind of meal. I let out a scream. I didn't feel it escape my mouth, and I didn't hear it, but I screamed the loudest scream that I have ever screamed in my life. I was lucky. My scream attracted the attention of some people who were walking past the bathroom, and soon they were banging at the door. It was locked, and all I could think of was I was trapped in with this creep. I kept screaming. I didn't know what else to do. I heard shouting from the other side of the bathroom door. Whoever was there had called for help. Eventually, they managed to break the door down. Seconds later, they grabbed hold of Winnie the Pooh and pulled him down. His face disappeared, and I heard a commotion on the other side. The rest of the day was a bit of a blur for me. I rushed out of the bathroom, and I didn't even think about looking back. I found my brothers, and I begged them to take me home. The police got involved later, and the guy was arrested. The scariest thing about the whole incident for me was how still and silent he was. The whole time he stared at me, he didn't make a single sound, and he didn't move at all. He just stared at me with those black, hungry eyes. Story number 2. A special souvenir. I used to live for Comic-Con and other similar conventions. My whole year revolved around dressing up and going to these conventions. I was never really good at the whole cosplay thing. I enjoyed it, but I was way out of my league. Sometimes I'd enjoy just going in normal clothes and taking photos with the other cosplayers. I mostly took photos with the ones dressed as my favorite characters from movies and video games, but I also took photos with the ones that were dressed so well that it was unreal. The one year, I'd been to about 3 different conventions already. The biggest of all the conventions, Comic-Con, was coming up. I'd had a rough year, so I decided not to go through the effort of dressing up. I knew there'd be plenty of hardcore cosplayers, and I'd feel like a fish out of water if I even attempted to dress up. I took plenty of pictures though, and I had a great time. There were a lot of celebrities talking that day, and I even got a few pictures with them. I was having the time of my life. It was the best Comic-Con I'd been to by far. The day was early, but I'd already been through the whole convention several times. I usually went through a few times. Some of the cosplayers arrived later than others. Each time I went through, I'd meet someone I hadn't seen before. It was around lunchtime, and I was heading out to get something to eat when I spotted him. I'm a huge superhero fan, and there he was. The best cosplay of Wolverine that I had ever seen. I hadn't seen him before, and honestly I couldn't contain my excitement. I rushed over, and I'm a little embarrassed by how silly I must have looked. I could barely get my words out as I asked him for a picture. He was so kind at first. He agreed to let me take a picture with him, and he even posed for a few solo images. I didn't notice anything wrong with him. He was charming, kind, and he liked how much I was gushing over his outfit. We ended up talking for a long time. He liked all the same movies and games that I liked. You can say what you want, but meeting someone at a Comic-Con is any cosplayer's dream. I thought this was the dream come true for me. That's why I didn't object when he suggested we go to his car. I forget what the excuse was. I think we were talking about a new version of a comic book that just came out, and he said he had it in his car. I followed him out of the safety of the convention and into the empty parking lot. His car was parked far from the main entrance. I was completely calm. I didn't think anything of it while we walked to his car. He'd been such a nice guy so far, and I had no reason to suspect anything sinister was about to happen. He opened the trunk of his car and told me to have a look. I leaned in, and I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. His trunk was empty. I felt his hand against my back, and he pushed hard. I tumbled into the trunk. My heart was racing. I was so confused. Up was down, and down was up. Some part of me that had a will to survive took over. I spun round and shot my legs out just as he tried to slam the trunk closed. The trunk slammed against my knee so hard, and a blood-curdling scream escaped my lips. He seemed to panic. He tried to shove my legs into the trunk so he could close it, but I just kept kicking out at him. One of my kicks struck his jaw, and he fell backwards. I took the opportunity to climb out of the trunk and sprint back towards the convention. My legs weren't working properly. The only thing that kept me going was the adrenaline rushing through my body. He wasn't following me, and I was able to get some help once I was inside. My knees swelled up, and he actually dislocated the one when he slammed the trunk down. I worsened it by running away, but I did what I had to do. I don't know if he had come to Comic-Con looking to kidnap someone, or if I was just an opportunity that he took advantage of. Either way, I'm a lot more cautious now when I go anywhere. Story number 3. The Quiet One. My father always told me that it's the quiet ones you need to look out for. He always warned me that the loud and confident kids aren't dangerous because you always know what they're thinking. The quiet kids are dangerous because you never know what they're thinking or what they're going to do. Now, I had a quiet kid in my group of friends. He was cool. He hardly ever spoke unless we directly spoke to him, and he usually kept his thoughts to himself. I never really worried about him. I think we kept him around because he was the only one of us that had a car. We really needed that car when Comic-Con came around. We weren't the cool friend group. We were, according to the majority of our classmates, the nerds. We loved everything that had anything to do with Comic-Con. George, that was the quiet kid in our group, didn't actually express any love for the same things. We always talked about comic books, video games, and mostly superheroes. He never joined in on the conversations, but he was always there when we had them. So we assumed he was into the same stuff. It was easy to get him to agree to take all of us to Comic-Con. He replied with a shrug, which meant sure for him. He hung around with us for most of the day. He wasn't a fan of crowds. This much we knew for sure about him after the one day during a school gathering when he had a breakdown. He never physically or verbally expressed any discomfort, not once the whole day. We were constantly in a long line or pushing through a crowd. He followed us everywhere we went. I kept looking back at that day and wondering if there was some way we could have known what was going to happen. I keep looking for some kind of sign. There wasn't one. He didn't let us know in any way that he was feeling uncomfortable. That was, until the moment he exploded. We were standing at the back of a particularly large crowd. I think there was going to be a developer talk on one of the fantasy games that was going to be released later in the year. Anyway, we were all very interested in the game and didn't want to miss the talk. George came along, like he had been doing all day. All the seats in the room were already taken, and everyone else took to standing in any available space. Pretty soon, there was no more space to move. People were piled up on top of each other. There was no more room for anyone else to come in, but people were still coming in. I didn't know what had happened, at least not at first. There was a lot of screaming, and suddenly I was being pushed towards the one side of the room. Everyone was trying to get away. They all wanted to get away from something. That was when I saw George. His eyes were wide and practically bulging out of his head. His teeth were bared and drool was dripping from the corners of his mouth. He grunted and growled like a wild animal. I looked down and his hands were dripping with blood. I couldn't process what was happening. His hands were covered in blood and there were bits of flesh hanging from his nails. The crowd continued to push me away, and I was able to see that there was someone lying on the floor. A puddle of blood poured from his body and soaked into the dark green carpeted floor. George had just lost it. He went mad. He turned into an animal on the spot and attacked the closest person to him. We were all hurried out of the event, and the security guards got involved. I visited George a few times after that. He'd been taken to an asylum for his and everyone else's safety. I stopped visiting. I guess I feel guilty because he was my friend and I should have noticed that he wasn't comfortable. You never know what the quiet kids are capable of. Story number 1. I'm sure that by now everyone knows about the things that happened in the Ukraine. There are a lot of stories. Some of them might sound unbelievable. Take it from somebody who was in the thick of it. The most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened. It came without warning. It was a normal day, and it seemed like nothing could go wrong. I was sitting at the table with my family. We often had family time where we'd play a whole bunch of games and watch movies. Most of the day was a blur, but I think we were playing Monopoly when it happened. At first, it was a low, distant boom. The ground vibrated slightly. I felt it and I heard it. I watched as my little silvered top hat rumbled across the board. I looked up and met eyes with my little sister. She felt it too. We looked around the table to see my older brother, mother, and father were also wondering what had caused the vibration. My first thought, as I stood up from the table, was that it could have been an earthquake. They aren't common in my area, but we have had a few in the past. I walked to the window at the far end of my apartment that looked down onto the road outside. We were in an apartment on the second floor, so I had a good view of the whole street. I moved the curtain aside and looked down to the road below. It was a cloudy day. The dark and damp outside made the next sight I saw even more chilling. There were people running through the streets. They started slow. A few people came running down the road, then a few more. Suddenly, everyone was running and screaming. There was another distant boom, but it was slightly closer than the last one, and the vibration that came after was strong enough to knock the whole Monopoly board off the table. I couldn't see what everyone was running from, but they were definitely running from something. I noticed a lot of people glancing over their shoulders as they ran. It was as if something was chasing them. My family were asking all sorts of questions. I could hear their voices, but nothing they said actually registered in my mind. I was too focused on the world outside. I ran across the room. There was a second window on the side of the apartment that gave a better look down the full length of the road, and I ran straight for it. I practically ripped the curtains off the railing when I threw them open to look outside. A shiver ran up my spine. The feeling I felt in that moment is almost indescribable. I couldn't breathe. My mind and body felt numb. My entire world turned upside down, and my life flashed before my eyes. It all changed in an instant. I looked out the window. I glanced down that road, and I saw a tank. It was so large that it took up most of the road. It moved slowly as groups of soldiers marched in front of and beside it. I'd only ever seen a tank in movies, and the thing in real life is so much more different. I saw the nose of the tank angle up slightly. The whole thing jolted back, and the loud boom filled the air once more. This time, the sound was deafening. The whole building shook, and for a moment, I thought the floor might crumble beneath my feet. I heard my little sister scream, and that snapped me out of my trance. I turned around. My parents had grabbed my brother and sister, and they were all trembling under the table we'd just been playing our game of Monopoly on. I rushed to join them. I didn't know what else to do. There was a tank riding down the road outside. People were screaming. The ground was shaking. There were explosions and gunshots. It was so unreal. I wrapped my arms around my body and hugged myself tight. I dug my nails into my arms, just to check that it wasn't some kind of nightmare, but I didn't wake up. It was real. My family and I stayed crouched under that table for what seemed like the longest time. The ground stopped shaking for a moment, but it wasn't long until the tank fired off another shot and the ground began shaking again. At the time, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what to think. We didn't know that the tank outside belonged to Russia and that it was Russian soldiers marching down the streets. It had been a normal day up until that point, and there was no reason for us to suspect that our country was about to be thrown into war. I know it probably doesn't seem as terrifying as I'm making it sound. If you looked out your window and saw what I saw, then you would understand. I thought the world was coming to an end, And in some ways, it did. My world came to an end. There weren't going to be any more family game nights. I looked around the small apartment that I had called home, and I thought it would be the last time I would see it again. It wasn't long until the soldiers started searching the buildings. We heard them yelling out in the halls. My little sister and mother screamed as they started banging on our door. The door creaked as the hinges gave way. The next thing I knew, I was being dragged out from underneath the table. A hand closed around the collar of my shirt and it yanked me from safety. There was so much noise around me that it was hard to tell what was happening. The soldiers had dragged me and my family out into the streets. They didn't tell us what was happening. The only time they ever spoke was to yell at us to keep moving or to stay quiet. It all seems like a distant dream now. We were evacuated and made to live in settlements and camps in the next town over. The place I once called my home was turned into a base camp or something for the Russian soldiers. No civilians are allowed back in, and no one who goes in ever comes out. My life was turned upside down that day, and I don't think I'll ever get it back. Story number 2, Orders. I won't give too many details as to who I am and where this story took place. I don't want to risk compromising myself, my friends, or my family. This story, which is like so many others, needs to be told. I'm a Russian soldier. Like so many of my fellow comrades, I joined the armed forces when I was only 19 years old. Before then, I lived in the Ukraine with my family. Like I said, I won't go into any details about the area I lived in. I had moved to Russia shortly after graduating because my young mind saw more potential to grow there than in the Ukraine. When things didn't work out, I was too stubborn to admit defeat and go back home, so a couple of my friends convinced me to sign up to the military with them. Anyway, it was on the day that Russia invaded Ukraine that I received some orders that I just couldn't follow. The invasion of Ukraine was questionable in itself, and we weren't being told anything. We didn't know why we were doing any of it. We were expected to follow our orders, no matter what. I left my home at 18 and joined the army at 19. The year I turned 26, I returned home, only I was marching down the street with a gun in my hand. We went from one house to the next. We kicked down the doors, pulled people from their beds and their kitchens. We dragged down out into the street and treated them like criminals. Everything I did that day made me want to vomit, but I was a soldier and I had orders to follow. We were told to evacuate the town, and we were given permission to use extreme force if anyone resisted. I'm thankful to say that no one resisted that day. I still don't know why they wanted the town evacuated. Like I said, we were given very little information as to why any of this was happening. I don't know what it was that made me change my mind that day. I don't know if it was the endless screams and cries for help. I don't know if it was the sick feeling in my stomach that only grew with each life I ruined. I don't know if it was seeing my old childhood home just a few blocks away from me. Whatever it was, I decided that day that I didn't want to be a soldier anymore. I managed to break off from my unit during the raid of one house. This was my hometown, so I knew all the shortcuts and back roads. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew that if I was caught, it would be over for me. The military doesn't take kindly to deserters and soldiers that disobey their orders. I made it to my home and hopped over the fence into my backyard. The sliding door was kept unlocked most of my childhood, so it was easy for me to sneak in. My hope was that I would find the house empty and my family already gone. That isn't what happened. As I walked through the house, I noticed that the windows were boarded up and the furniture was stacked up against the front door. My family had barricaded themselves in. I guess they didn't expect the soldiers to hop over the fence and come through the back. My walkthrough of the house took longer than I expected. By the time I went to go upstairs, I found the stairway was blocked by mattresses and couch cushions. I ducked under and climbed over what I could. The rest I had to move out of the way. Once I got to the top, I could hear the screams from outside getting closer as the soldiers marched further down the street. I knew I didn't have a lot of time, so I practically ran through the house, throwing every door open and scanning every room. I tried the bathroom door, but it was locked. I started banging on the door and pleading for someone to open it. My heart sank to the floor when I heard my mother's voice reply. She opened the door and hurried me inside. I had a plan to explain myself, but what I saw inside that bathroom took all the words out of my mouth. My father was hiding near the back of the room with a shotgun in his hand and a pile of bullets sitting in the sink beside him. My little sister, who was only 16 at the time, was sitting in the bathtub with her arms wrapped around her knees and her face buried in her chest. My family were terrified. I could see from the looks on their faces that they were ready to fight, but they didn't know that the soldiers wouldn't hesitate to kill them if they did. I didn't have time to explain, but my family trusted me and followed me out of the house. I led them out to the backyard and helped them climb over the fence. I held my little sister close as I led them through the back roads. I can't explain what I was thinking at the time. A million thoughts were racing through my head. I could hear the soldiers were so close to us now. I got my family out of there. That was the only thing I could do. I got them to the next town, and from there we were able to get a car and drive a few more towns over. That day I took my uniform off, and I vowed never to put it on again. My family means more to me than following orders. Story number 3, 40 Days and 40 Nights. I'm writing this story from the comfort of a house in England, which I was able to escape to after the Russian soldiers invaded my home in the Ukraine. Not everyone was as lucky as I was. My father was a worker at Industrial Steel Company. They specialized in manufacturing steel beams and metal for construction. My father had worked there for as long as I can remember. When Russia invaded, what happened to me and my mother was pretty standard. A curfew was put into place. We were told to stay indoors unless it was an emergency. The use of cars and public transport was forbidden. There were Russian soldiers patrolling the streets day and night. We were cut off from the world, with no internet connection and barely any water or electricity. My father had it worse. At the time of the invasion, he was at work at the steel mill. The Russian soldiers wanted to take control of the mill for various reasons, but Ukrainian soldiers were sent there to occupy the area before they could. This was a shock to all of us, especially my father and the other workers. The entire steel mill was shut down in an instant. No one was allowed in, and no one was allowed out. Soldiers set up barricades around the place, and my father was trapped inside. The Ukrainian soldiers kept the mill under their control for all that time. The workers were given food, water, and blankets to sleep with. It was no life to live. They were trapped inside, and my father told me that he hadn't seen the sun or even the sky all that time. He said he'd forgotten what the sky even looked like. 40 days and 40 nights passed before I saw my father again, and even then, the nightmare wasn't over yet. It was 40 days and 40 nights before the Ukrainian soldiers ran out of supplies and had to surrender to the Russians. They invaded the mill, and everyone inside was taken away. I saw my father for only a moment before they loaded him into a jeep with the other workers. I couldn't believe the look on his face. His eyes were lifeless and sunken. My father was always joyful and always smiling, but the man they pulled from that steel mill had no joy left in him. I'm not sure where they took my father, but he was released to us over a month later. He refuses to talk about it or the time he spent in the mill. The only information I have is stories and rumors I heard from neighbors on the street. Those 40 days and 40 nights changed my father forever. He still hasn't smiled, and some nights I walked into their room to see him sleeping on the floor. It's like his mind is still trapped inside that steel mill.